This was not a diplomatic failure. This was a deliberate rupture. In a single morning, one decision erased months of quiet negotiations and exposed the reality many refused to face. Not slowly, not ambiguously, but in full view of the world. When a ceasefire is rejected without counteroffers, without hesitation, without restraint, that is not diplomacy breaking down. That is power being asserted. I've studied wars long enough to recognize this moment. When a leader demands total surrender disguised as peace, the system does not de-escalate. It hardens. And what followed today was not confusion. It was alignment under pressure. Washington pivoted with speed. Europe recalibrated. And Kyiv did something no one expected. It spoke for itself. If you think this was just another failed proposal, you're missing the real story. What collapsed today wasn't a deal. It was the assumption that Ukraine would remain silent about its own future. Stay with me, because to understand what comes next, we must first understand how we arrived here. To understand why this moment matters, we need to be precise about what is actually at stake. This is not just a disagreement over territory. It is not simply a failed ceasefire. What unfolded was a confrontation between three incompatible assumptions about how this war should end. Moscow assumed that pressure creates compliance, that exhaustion leads to surrender. That time still works in Russia's favor. Washington assumed that leverage plus incentives could still produce a transactional pause, a framework that freezes the conflict long enough to stabilize the system. And Ukraine assumed something fundamentally different, that no peace imposed without its consent can ever hold. These assumptions cannot coexist. They collide. That collision explains why Putin's response was absolute, why Trump's reaction was immediate, and why Kyiv refused to wait quietly on the sidelines. Each actor acted logically, but from entirely different logics. When systems operate on incompatible premises, outcomes accelerate. Signals become ultimatums. Diplomacy becomes pressure. And once that happens, restraint no longer looks like stability. It starts to look like weakness. To see how these assumptions were formed and why they hardened over time, we have to go back to where this conflict's deeper mechanics began. Every conflict has a visible front line, but the real battles are almost always fought somewhere else, inside systems, incentives, and unresolved history. This war did not begin with a single invasion order. It began with a long cycle of assumptions, left unchallenged. For years, the system rewarded ambiguity. Ceasefires that froze rather than solved, negotiations that postponed rather than resolved. Agreements built to manage conflict, not end it. Over time, that created a dangerous illusion that endurance could substitute for resolution, that pressure could replace consent, that smaller states would eventually adapt to decisions made over their heads. Each cycle reinforced the next. Military action produced talks. Talks produced pauses. Pauses produced rearmament and resentment. This is how conflicts become structural. Not because leaders want endless war, but because the system offers no credible exit that preserves dignity for all sides. By the time the latest ceasefire proposal appeared, the ground beneath it was already brittle. Too many expectations, too many red lines, too little trust. So when the moment came to choose compromise or confrontation, the system chose exactly as it had been trained to choose. And that choice set the stage for the first real rupture. The rupture didn't arrive with chaos. It arrived with precision. When the rejection came, it wasn't softened by language or delayed by procedure. It was total, no revisions, no alternatives, no room to maneuver. That mattered more than the content itself. Because in diplomacy, how something is rejected often carries more weight than what is rejected. And this rejection was designed to close doors, not open them. The demands were absolute demilitarization, permanent exclusion, recognition without reciprocity, not terms meant to be discussed, but conditions meant to dominate. A message wrapped in formal language: there will be no compromise. And then came the second signal. Almost immediately, military pressure followed diplomatic refusal. That sequence is never accidental. It tells you this wasn't an emotional decision or a breakdown in talks. It was synchronized, prepared, executed. At that moment, the ceasefire proposal stopped being a path to peace and became something else entirely, a trigger. And once a proposal becomes a trigger, restraint is no longer neutral. It becomes a choice. If this were just about negotiation, the story might have slowed here. But what happened next ensured it would accelerate. To see why this moment escalated so quickly, you have to look beneath the statements and into the machinery that produced them. This war is no longer driven primarily by battlefield momentum. It is driven by credibility. For Moscow, credibility means proving that pressure still works, that refusal does not carry costs, that endurance will eventually fracture unity on the other side. Every concession, in that logic, becomes a threat to internal authority. For Washington, credibility means something different. It means showing that engagement does not equal vulnerability, that offering a framework does not invite humiliation. And for Ukraine, credibility has become existential. After years of survival, silence is no longer neutrality. It is erasure. These three definitions cannot be reconciled through half measures. They create a zero-sum dynamic even when no one explicitly declares one. That is why the system reacted the way it did. Once the rejection landed, delay would have signaled weakness. Hesitation would have validated the gamble. So the response was speed. Speed is how systems defend credibility when trust is gone. It compresses decision-making. It removes ambiguity. It forces alignment. And once that mechanism is activated, events stop unfolding, they cascade. The next cascade would not come from diplomacy. It would come from the battlefield. The second shock did not arrive as a surprise. It arrived as confirmation. Within hours, pressure moved from language to action. Missiles, infrastructure, timelines compressed into minutes instead of weeks. This is the moment analysts watch for when diplomacy and military operations merge into a single message. Not escalation for its own sake, but synchronization. The rejection was never meant to stand alone. It was paired with force to prove credibility, to show that refusal would not slow momentum but accelerate it. But here is where the calculation began to fracture. Military pressure only works if the other side pauses. If fear creates hesitation, if allies drift, none of that happened. Instead, the response was immediate and targeted. Capabilities long debated were suddenly approved. Constraints quietly vanished. This wasn't emotional retaliation. It was structural adjustment. The battlefield equation began to shift not because of rhetoric, but because systems adapted faster than expected. What was meant to intimidate instead clarified intentions. What was meant to deter instead unified decision-making. And once that line is crossed, there is no return to the previous tempo. From this point on, every move carries amplified meaning. Every delay looks intentional. Every action invites interpretation. The war had entered a faster phase, and the most consequential response had not yet come. Now, I want you to think about where all of this actually lands. Not on maps, not in statements, but on people, because when systems harden and credibility replaces compromise, it is never leaders who absorb the cost first. It is civilians, families, cities that learn to live between alarms. If you are watching this from a distance, it can feel abstract. Missiles become numbers. Aid packages become headlines. Timelines blur. But for Ukrainians, there is no abstraction. Every escalation changes daily life. Every rejection extends uncertainty. Every delay stretches endurance. And yet, something profound happened here. Instead of waiting quietly for decisions made elsewhere, Ukraine asserted itself. It said, our survival is not a bargaining chip. Our future is not something to be traded for convenience. That matters not just morally, but structurally. Because when people believe they are invisible, systems collapse. When they believe they are heard, they endure. If you care about how wars actually end, not on paper, but in reality, this is the moment you should pay attention. Because agency changes outcomes, and what that agency now means for the wider world is where this story truly expands. Once Ukraine asserted itself, the conflict stopped being regional in any meaningful sense. It became systemic, because every major power watching understood what this moment implied. If pressure could silence Kyiv, it would validate a model far beyond this war. If it failed, the precedent would run in the opposite direction. That is why reactions moved so quickly across Europe. Not out of sentiment, but out of self-interest. Security architectures depend on predictability, and this rupture threatened to rewrite the rules. Energy markets responded, defense coordination tightened, diplomatic language hardened. What looked like a single rejection triggered a chain reaction, not because allies wanted escalation, but because ambiguity had become more dangerous than clarity. In global systems, hesitation invites opportunism. Alignment deters it. This is why unity mattered more than any individual weapon system, why speed mattered more than symbolism, why messaging mattered as much as material support. The war had crossed a threshold where outcomes would no longer be decided solely on the battlefield. They would be decided by whether international systems could absorb pressure without fracturing. And as that realization set in, attention shifted forward away from today's shock and toward tomorrow's possibilities. Because from here, the future stops being singular. It branches. From this point forward, the future no longer moves in a straight line. It divides into paths, each shaped by choices made under pressure. The first path is restraint with recalibration. In this scenario, pressure forces reconsideration. Signals soften. Back channels reopen. Not because trust returns, but because costs become undeniable. Negotiations resume narrower, harder, but grounded in reality rather than illusion. The second path is managed escalation. Support deepens. Military pressure intensifies. Diplomacy exists, but only as a parallel track, not a solution. The war stabilizes at a higher level of intensity, survivable, but unresolved. A conflict contained, not concluded. The third path is the most dangerous. Not total war, but perpetual instability. A frozen conflict maintained through disruption, enough violence to prevent recovery, enough ambiguity to avoid resolution. This is the path systems fall into when no actor believes compromise preserves credibility. When everyone chooses endurance over closure, which path emerges will not depend on rhetoric. It will depend on whether leaders learn the right lesson from this rupture. That lesson is simple, but rarely accepted. Wars end when agency is recognized, not erased. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment ultimately tells us. What today revealed is not who is strongest, but who is adapting. Power that cannot bend breaks systems. Diplomacy that excludes agency collapses credibility, and proposals that ask for silence in exchange for stability never endure. Putin believed rejection would project strength. Instead, it exposed rigidity. Trump believed leverage required risk and showed adaptability under pressure. And Ukraine proved something even more consequential, that survival without voice is not peace. This is how historical turning points actually happen. Not with treaties signed overnight, but with assumptions stripped away. Illusions fall first. Structures follow. If you take one insight from this moment, let it be this. Endurance is not passive. Agency is not optional. And systems that ignore either eventually fail. What comes next will test every actor involved. Resolve, unity, patience. Not for days, but for years. If you want to keep understanding how power, pressure, and people shape the world we're entering, stay here. Share this analysis. And watch what happens next. Because this story is not over. It is only entering its next phase.